The scent of 10,000 white orchids hung heavy in the air of the Cathedral of Saint Jude, a fragrance so dense it bordered on intoxicating. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns of crimson, gold, and sapphire across the polished marble floor. It was a picturesque Saturday in late June, the kind of day that felt custom-made for a fairy tale. Soft, melodic notes from a live string quartet drifted through the cavernous space, weaving a tapestry of romance that brought tears to the eyes of the 300 guests seated in the mahogany pews, standing in the vestibule. Hidden from the crowd, I took a deep, trembling breath. My name is Emily Carter. And at that exact moment, I was the happiest woman in the world. I looked down at my dress, a custom silk mikado gown that was elegant in its simplicity, free of the ostentatious jewels and heavy lace that so many modern brides favored. My fingers traced the delicate embroidery along the veil. My heart hammered a frantic, joyous rhythm against my ribs. In just a few minutes, the heavy oak doors would swing open, and I would walk down the aisle to marry Daniel Whitmore, the man I believed to be my soulmate, my partner, and my future. I truly believed it was the most beautiful day of my life. I believed that the man waiting for me at the altar loved me for exactly who I was. By the end of that day, I would lose my fiancé, and he would lose absolutely everything. Had I known what was waiting for me at the end of that aisle, I wouldn't have felt the nervous flutter of butterflies in my stomach. I would have felt the cold, hard steel of a reality check. But ignorance, as they say, is a warm and comforting blanket, and I was wrapped tightly in it, blissfully unaware of the catastrophic storm that was about to obliterate my perfect world. To understand the magnitude of the betrayal, you have to understand the dynamic between Daniel and me. By all outward appearances, I was profoundly average. I was soft-spoken, preferred reading a book on a Saturday night over attending loud galas, and dressed in understated, neutral tones. I told people, including Daniel, that I was a freelance design consultant and occasionally taught art history at a local community college. I drove a sensible, 4-year-old Volvo. I lived in a comfortable but modest 2-bedroom apartment. I vehemently despised showing off. What I didn't tell people was the truth. I was the controlling shareholder and the unseen chairwoman of Ashford Global, a multi-billion-dollar multinational conglomerate, with interests spanning from commercial real estate to renewable energy tech. The company had been founded by my grandfather, a shrewd but deeply private tycoon who despised the limelight as much as I did. When he passed away, he left the empire to me, knowing my older brother, Marcus, had no interest in corporate warfare. Preferring his life as a pediatric surgeon, I kept my identity a fiercely guarded secret. In a world obsessed with wealth, I wanted to be loved for my mind, my heart, and my character, not my bank account. Only a handful of top-tier executives and legal counsel knew that Emily Carter, the quiet freelancer, was actually the puppet master, pulling the strings of one of the most powerful corporations on the East Coast. Daniel Whitmore, on the other hand, was a man consumed by the hunger for status. We had met at a coffee shop 3 years prior. He was handsome, charismatic, and armed with a smile that could disarm a bank guard. He was a mid-level project manager at Ashford Global. He had no idea he was flirting with his ultimate boss. He was fiercely ambitious, always talking about the corporate ladder, the grind, and his desperate desire to break into the upper echelons of high society. I found his drive endearing at first. I thought he was just a hard-working man trying to build a stable life. But Daniel's ambition had a darker, more insidious side. He was obsessed with optics. He cared deeply about brand names, VIP lists, and who was seen with whom. And then there was Vanessa Caldwell. Vanessa was the daughter of Robert Caldwell, the man I employed to act as the public-facing chief executive officer of Ashford Global. Vanessa was a newly appointed director of communications, a title handed to her entirely through nepotism. She was everything I pretended not to be: loud, dripping in designer labels, endlessly arrogant, and convinced that the world owed her its undivided attention. She was a woman who believed that a person's worth was calculated by their net worth and their pedigree. More importantly, she had made it abundantly clear around the office that she believed Daniel was her perfect match, a handsome, pliable accessory to complement her corporate royalty. Daniel's family shared Vanessa's toxic worldview. The Whitmores were a middle-class family that lived perpetually beyond their means, desperate to project an image of old money. His mother, Eleanor, had never liked me. During Sunday dinners, she would look at my simple, unbranded sweaters and sneer. "Are you still doing that freelance thing, Emily?" she would ask, her voice dripping with condescension. "Daniel is on the fast track at Ashford. He needs a woman who can host corporate dinners. Someone with connections, not a teacher." Daniel would usually just laugh uncomfortably and change the subject. I brushed it off, blinded by love, telling myself that when we were married, his family's opinions wouldn't matter. I was so incredibly wrong. In the 6 weeks leading up to the wedding, the red flags didn't just wave, they snapped violently in the wind. But love has a funny way of making you colorblind. Daniel grew distant. The warm, late-night conversations we used to share were replaced by brief, transactional texts. He was always working late, always caught up in a massive merger. "It's going to be worth it, Em," he told me one evening, not making eye contact as he aggressively typed on his phone. "Big things are happening at Ashford. Caldwell is finally noticing my potential. I just have to put in the hours right now." I tried to be the supportive fiancé. I cooked him dinners that went cold. I ironed his shirts. But there were details I couldn't ignore. No matter how hard I tried, the faint, lingering scent of Tom Ford Black Orchid, a heavy, aggressive perfume, I knew for a fact Vanessa Caldwell wore clinging to his suit jacket. The way he would quickly lock his phone screen when I walked into the room, the sudden, unexplained charges on our shared credit card for high-end steakhouses, which he quickly dismissed as client dinners. My brother, Marcus, noticed. Marcus was fiercely protective of me and possessed a finely tuned bullshit detector. "I don't like it, Em," Marcus had said just 3 days before the wedding, pacing my apartment as I finalized the seating chart. "The guy looks at you like you're a convenience, not a partner. He's obsessed with his image. Have you seen the way he talks to the waitstaff? Have you seen how his mother treats you? You're a billionaire, Emily. You could buy and sell his entire bloodline before breakfast. Why are you putting up with this? Because he doesn't know about the money." "Marcus," I replied softly, defensive. "He loves me. He's just stressed about the wedding and his promotion. It's just wedding jitters." Marcus stopped pacing and looked at me with deep, sorrowful eyes. "I hope you're right, little sister. But a man's true character shows when he thinks he has nothing to lose." I dismissed my brother's warnings as overprotectiveness. I ironed out the seating chart, paid the final invoices to the caterers, and prepared to pledge my life to a man who was already slipping out the back door. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral finally swung open. The string quartet transitioned smoothly into Wagner's bridal chorus. The crowd stood in unison, with Marcus's arm looped securely through mine. I began the long walk down the aisle. My eyes were locked on Daniel. He stood at the altar in a custom tuxedo I had secretly paid for. He looked incredibly handsome. But as I drew closer, the smile I expected to see on his face was entirely absent. His jaw was clenched tight. His eyes were wide, darting nervously across the front pews. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad. Not his future wife. When Marcus handed me off to Daniel, he gave him a firm, warning look before taking his seat. I took Daniel's hands. They were ice cold. The priest began his welcoming remarks. He spoke beautifully of love, commitment, and the sacred bond of marriage. The cathedral was dead silent, the guests hanging onto every word. "Daniel," the priest finally asked, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "Do you take Emily to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" Silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The guests began to shift uncomfortably. A low murmur rippled through the back pews. I squeezed his hands. "Daniel?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Daniel." "What's wrong?" Daniel slowly pulled his hands out of my grasp. He took a step back, putting a terrifying amount of physical space between us. He looked at me, his expression hardening, transitioning from nervousness to a chilling, calculated resolve. "I can't," he said. His voice carried through the microphone clipped to the priest's robe. It boomed through the cathedral speakers. "What?" I gasped, the blood draining from my face. My knees suddenly felt like water. "I can't marry you." "Emily," Daniel said, his voice steadier now, projecting to the room. A collective gasp echoed off the marble walls. 300 people recoiled in shock. The priest lowered his book. Stunned, Marcus half stood from his pew, his fists already clenched. "Daniel, please." "Ibegel." Tears instantly welling in my eyes. Completely ignoring the crowd. "Please. Don't do this. If you're scared, we can stop. We can go into the back room and talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Daniel interrupted, his tone remarkably devoid of empathy. He looked past me, his eyes landing on the middle of the aisle. "I'm sorry, Emily, but I'm in love with someone else." The murmurs erupted into a cacophony of whispers and muffled cries. I turned my head, following his gaze. Standing up from a pew halfway down the aisle was Vanessa Caldwell. She wasn't wearing a subtle, guest-appropriate outfit. She was wearing a stunning, deeply plunging crimson gown that screamed for attention. A dress meant to upstage a bride. She stepped out into the center aisle. A smug, victorious smirk playing on her cherry-red lips. She walked slowly toward the altar, with every click of her Louboutin heels against the marble. A piece of my heart shattered. When she reached the front, Daniel stepped down from the altar. He didn't look at me again. He reached out, took Vanessa's hand, and pulled her close to his side. "This is the woman I'm meant to be with," Daniel announced to the stunned crowd, his voice laced with an arrogant pride. I looked at the front row, expecting to see horror on the faces of Daniel's family. Instead, I saw his mother, Eleanor, sitting tall, a terrifying, triumphant smile stretched across her face. She actually started clapping. It was a slow, deliberate clap that cut through the shocked silence of the room. A few of Daniel's obnoxious cousins joined in. They were laughing. They were actually laughing at me. Eleanor leaned over to her sister. But in the echoing acoustics of the church, Her stage whisper was loud enough for the first 5 rows to hear perfectly. Thank God. Eleanor hissed loudly. She was never good enough for him anyway. A freelance, nobody holding him back. Our boy is finally moving up. I stood alone at the altar, drowning in a sea of white silk, utterly paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of the spectacle. Marcus vaulted over the front pew, his face purple with rage, marching straight toward Daniel. But before Marcus could throw a punch that would undoubtedly end in a police intervention, Daniel raised his hand, addressing the room as if he were giving a keynote speech at a corporate retreat rather than destroying a woman's life. I know this is shocking, Daniel said loudly, projecting his voice over the chaos. But I have to follow my future. Robert Caldwell, the CEO of Ashford Global, has offered me a promotion. I'm going to be the new vice president of operations. And? He looked lovingly at Vanessa, who was practically glowing with malice. He has given us his blessing. The room spun. I felt bile rising in my throat. It wasn't just an affair. It was a transaction. Daniel had sold his soul and our 3-year relationship for a corner office and a title. He believed he had hit the jackpot. He believed he was marrying into corporate royalty, securing his place in the elite class he so desperately craved. He didn't see me as a human being anymore. He saw me as a stepping stone he had successfully leaped over. Let's go. Darling, Vanessa said loudly, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. We have a flight to Paris to catch tonight. Our real celebration. Daniel nodded. He turned his back on me completely, hand in hand with his boss's daughter. Daniel Whitmore marched back down the aisle. His chest puffed out. A conquering hero in his own twisted narrative. His family quickly stood up, grabbing their coats and trailing behind him like a royal procession, casting triumphant, pitying sneers in my direction as they left. The cathedral doors slammed shut behind them. The echo of the slam resonated in my chest. My legs finally gave out. I collapsed to my knees on the cold marble floor, burying my face in my hands. As the most profound, agonizing humiliation washed over me, Marcus was by my side in an instant, wrapping his strong arms around my trembling shoulders, shouting at the wedding planner to clear the church. I cried until I couldn't breathe. I mourned the man I thought I knew, but as I sat in the bridal suite an hour later, staring at my ruined mascara in the mirror, the agonizing sorrow began to morph. The tears dried up. The shaking stopped. A cold, terrifyingly calm clarity took over. I'm going to kill him. Marcus paced the length of the bridal suite, his tie discarded, his collar unbuttoned. I will literally dismantle his life. I'll hire investigators. I'll make sure he never works in this city again. I sat perfectly still on the velvet sofa. No. Marcus. Marcus stopped, staring at me in disbelief. Emily, did you not just see what happened out there? He didn't just leave you, he made a public spectacle out of destroying you for his career. I know, I said, my voice eerily quiet. I reached over to the side table, picked up my cell phone, and unlocked it. He traded me for a vice president title at Ashford Global, which is exactly why you need to let me call the lawyers and Marcus. I interrupted, looking up at him. Who owns Ashford Global? Marcus blinked, thrown off by the question. You do. The Carter Trust holds 68% of the voting shares. You're the chairwoman of the board. And who is Robert Caldwell? I asked. He's the CEO. Marcus replied, his brow furrowing as he began to realize where I was going. He's the guy, Grandpa, hired to run the day-to-day operations so you could stay out of the public eye. Exactly. I murmured, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Robert Caldwell is an employee. A high-paid, powerful employee. But an employee, nonetheless. He answers to the board. And the board answers to me. For 3 years, I had kept my secret because I was terrified of men loving my power instead of my soul. Daniel had just proven that my worst fears were entirely justified, but he had made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. In his desperate scramble to climb the corporate ladder, he had stepped on the neck of the person who owned the entire building. I dialed a number on my phone. It rang twice before it was picked up. Ms. Carter. The crisp, professional voice of Jonathan Vance, the chief legal counsel for Ashford Global, answered. Jonathan, I said, my tone completely devoid of the sweet, gentle demeanor I usually carried. I need you to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I want Robert Caldwell there. I want Vanessa Caldwell there. And I want the newly minted Vice President of Operations, Daniel Whitmore. In attendance. An emergency meeting. Ma'am? Jonathan asked, slightly taken aback. May I ask the agenda? Restructuring. I said coldly. I'm done hiding in the shadows. Jonathan. Tomorrow morning. I am taking my seat at the head of the table. Monday morning dawned bright and clear. Completely indifferent to the chaos of the weekend, at 7:30 a.m. Daniel Whitmore strode into the towering glass and steel lobby of the Ashford Global headquarters in downtown Manhattan. He was wearing a brand new, charcoal gray Brioni suit, undoubtedly purchased on Vanessa's credit card. He walked with a swagger that bordered on comical, his chin tilted up, acting as though his name was already etched into the brass plaque on the front of the building. Vanessa was on his arm, holding a massive iced coffee, giggling at something he said. Even more absurdly, Daniel's parent, Eleanor and Thomas Whitmore, were trailing behind them. They had insisted on coming to the office to see their boy's new corner suite and take pictures of his first day as a corporate elite. The security guards in the lobby, unaware of the impending doom, buzzed them through the VIP turnstiles. They took the private executive elevator to the 50th floor. When the doors chimed and slid open, they were greeted by the sprawling, opulent reception area of the C-suite. A few administrative assistants offered polite, tight-lipped congratulations. This way. Mum. Daniel beamed, leading his mother toward a massive corner office with panoramic views of the city skyline. Caldwell promised me this suite. It's almost 3 times the size of my old cubicle. Eleanor clasped her hands together, practically weeping with pride. Oh, Danny, it's magnificent. Look at this view, it's exactly what you deserve. To think, you almost threw all this away on that mousy little freelancer. I know. Mom. Daniel laughed. A hollow, cruel sound dodged a massive bullet there. Emily was sweet, but she had zero ambition. She would have anchored me to mediocrity. Well, you're with a winner now, Vanessa purred, wrapping her arms around Daniel's neck and kissing his cheek. My father is so impressed with your initiative. We have a board meeting at 8. And he's going to officially introduce you to the executives as the new VP. Daniel straightened his tie, checking his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window. Let's go show them what the future of Ashford Global looks like. At precisely 7:55 a.m. The atmosphere in the executive boardroom was tense. The room was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation, a massive slab of polished mahogany acting as a table, surrounded by 20 leather chairs. The walls were lined with screens displaying global market tickers. 15 of the top executives, including the Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer, were already seated, murmuring quietly amongst themselves. They had received the emergency summons late Sunday night and were on edge. Robert Caldwell sat near the head of the table, looking incredibly smug. Next to him sat Vanessa, looking bored, checking her nails. And next to her, beaming like a lottery winner, sat Daniel. His parents had been allowed to sit in the viewing gallery chairs against the back wall, practically vibrating with excitement. The digital clock on the wall flipped to 8 a.m. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom clicked open. The room instantly fell silent. I walked in. I was not wearing a modest cardigan. I was not wearing sensible flats. I was wearing a razor-sharp, tailored black Tom Ford power suit. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving chignon. I wore a pair of stilettos that echoed with the authority of a judge's gavel against the hardwood floor. Flanking me on my right was Jonathan Vance, the chief legal counsel. On my left was Marcus, acting as my personal proxy and security. I kept my eyes fixed dead ahead as I walked the length of the room. As I passed the halfway mark, a profound, terrifying shift occurred. The chief financial officer, an older man who had worked with my grandfather, immediately stood up. Following his lead, the COO stood up. Within seconds, every single senior executive at the table, all the people who actually ran the company, pushed their chairs back and stood at attention. Jonathan Vance cleared his throat. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen." In perfect unison, the standing executives bowed their heads slightly. "Good morning, Chairwoman," they echoed respectfully. I stopped at the head of the table, the only seat that had remained empty, my grandfather's seat. I looked down the length of the mahogany wood. Robert Caldwell was frozen in his chair, his face entirely drained of blood, his mouth hanging slightly open in a grotesque mask of shock. But it was Daniel's reaction that belonged in a museum. Daniel was staring at me as if I had just crawled out of a television screen. His eyes were bulging so far out of his skull I thought they might pop. The smug, victorious grin he had worn moments ago had completely melted away, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. His brain was visibly short-circuiting, desperately trying to reconcile the image of his mousy freelancer, ex-fiancée, with the woman commanding the absolute submission of a multi-billion-dollar boardroom. In the back row, Eleanor Whitmore dropped her designer handbag. The loud thud was the only sound in the dead-silent room. "Please, be seated," I said. My voice was calm, authoritative, and completely unrecognizable from the girl who had cried at the altar. The executives sat in unison. Robert Caldwell, Vanessa, and Daniel remained paralyzed. "What? What is this?" Vanessa finally stammered, her voice shrill, darting her eyes between me and her father. "Dad, what is she doing here? Why did they call her chairwoman? Kick her out. Security." Robert Caldwell slowly turned to his daughter, sweat beading on his forehead. "Vanessa." "Shut up." "I will not shut up," Vanessa shrieked, standing up. "This is Daniel's crazy ex. She's a nobody." "Ms. Caldwell," Jonathan Vance said smoothly, opening a thick leather binder on the table, "I suggest you listen to your father. You are currently raising your voice at Emily Carter, the sole beneficiary of the Carter Trust, which holds 68% of Ashford Global's voting stock. She is the principal owner of this conglomerate. She is your boss's boss." Daniel made a sound that was half gasp, half choke. He looked at me, his face ash white. "Emily?" he whispered, his voice cracking violently. "You're You're. I finally looked directly at him. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I looked at him with the cold, sterile detachment of a scientist examining an insect. Good morning, Daniel, I said. I hope you enjoyed your brief tenure as vice president. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table. Let's dispense with the pleasantries and get straight to the agenda, I announced, intertwining my fingers on the desk. As of 8 a.m. this morning, I am officially exercising my rights as majority shareholder to restructure the executive leadership of Ashford Global. I nodded to Jonathan. He began passing out thick folders to the executives. First, I said, turning my gaze to Robert Caldwell. The man looked like he was about to have a myocardial infarction. Mr. Caldwell, you were hired to execute the strategic vision of this board. Instead, it has come to my attention that you have been utilizing corporate resources as your personal fiefdom. Chairwoman Carter. Caldwell started, his voice trembling. Do not interrupt me. I snapped. The command cracked like a whip. Caldwell instantly snapped his mouth shut. You created a director of communications role entirely to pad your daughter's resume. Despite her lack of qualifications, I continued, reading from the notes Jonathan had prepared. And, more egregiously, you bypassed all internal HR protocols, ignored the promotional pipeline, and attempted to install an underqualified mid-level manager into a vice president role simply because he was sleeping with your daughter. I paused, letting the weight of the accusation hang in the air. As majority shareholder, I possess the unilateral right to veto any executive appointment, and the right to terminate the chief executive officer with cause. I stated flatly, consider your appointment of Daniel Whitmore vetoed. Furthermore, consider this your official notice of suspension pending a full forensic audit of your tenure as CEO. You can't do this, Vanessa screamed, slamming her hands on the table. My father built this company's modern portfolio. You're just a bitter, jealous little bitch who got dumped at the altar. Marcus took a menacing step forward, but I raised my hand, stopping him. Jonathan, I said calmly. Yes. Chairwoman? Have security escort Ms. Life Caldwell from the premises. Her employment is terminated, effective immediately, and cancel her corporate credit cards before she reaches the lobby. 2 burly security guards in dark suits immediately stepped out from the shadows near the door. They flanked Vanessa, grabbing her by the elbows. She thrashed, screaming profanities at me, crying out for Daniel to do something. Daniel didn't move an inch. He was staring at the table, completely broken, hyperventilating. Once Vanessa's shrieks faded down the hallway, the room returned to a heavy silence. Now, I said, turning my attention to the man who, less than 48 hours ago, had promised to love me forever. Let us address Mr. Nestater. Whitmore. I clicked a remote in my hand. The large screen behind me illuminated, casting a blue glow over the room. If anyone is concerned that my actions today are motivated entirely by personal grievance, let me assuage your fears, I said smoothly. My personal life is irrelevant to the health of this corporation. Mr. Whitmore's termination is purely a matter of corporate espionage, ethics violations, and gross misconduct. I clicked the remote. A slide appeared on the screen. It was a screenshot of an email, time-stamped 3 weeks ago, sent from Daniel's secure corporate account to a competitor firm, offering proprietary data in exchange for a guaranteed executive position if his promotion at Ashford fell through. The executives around the table gasped. That was a federal crime. I clicked again. Text messages appeared. They were between Daniel and Vanessa. Daniel, the wedding is just a formality to keep her quiet until the VP announcement, once your dad signs the paperwork. I'm dropping her. I can't stand playing house in that dumpy apartment anymore. Vanessa, you better. My dad says the VP slot is yours as soon as you're officially part of our family. Just dump the freelancer publicly. Make a statement. Show my dad you're loyal to US. Daniel, consider it done. Baba. We're going to run this city. Daniel buried his face in his hands. Allo. Pathetic sob escaped his throat. From the back of the room, Eleanor Whitmore was crying hysterically, realizing that not only was her son's career over, but he was likely facing criminal charges. Mr. Whitmore, I said, my voice echoing coldly in the cavernous room. You used company time and company devices to negotiate corporate treason. You engaged in a heavily inappropriate relationship with a superior's daughter for financial gain. You have violated a half-dozen clauses in your employment contract. I leaned forward. You are fired. You will receive no severance. You will surrender your company phone, your laptop, and your access badge immediately. Jonathan has already forwarded the evidence of your data leak to the SEC and the district attorney. Daniel slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red and puffy. The arrogant, handsome man from the altar was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out, pathetic shell. Emily. Please, he whispered, his voice cracking. Please. I didn't know. I swear to God. If I had known who you were. I know. Daniel. I interrupted softly. If you had known my net worth, you would have married me. That is exactly why I didn't tell you. I sat back in my chair. Security. Escort Mr. Whitmore and his family out of my building. Daniel was hauled to his feet by the guards. He didn't fight back. He walked with his head hung in absolute shame. Eleanor tried to protest, but a guard simply pointed toward the door, and she scurried out. Her dreams of high society shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The execution was swift and merciless. Within 48 hours, Robert Caldwell was officially ousted by the board. The forensic audit revealed millions in embezzled funds disguised as consulting fees, ensuring he would spend the next decade fighting federal indictments. Vanessa, stripped of her corporate backing and her father's endless credit limits, practically vanished from the socialite scene overnight. But Daniel's downfall was legendary. In the digital age, nothing remains a secret. A guest from my side of the aisle had recorded the entire wedding debacle on their phone. When the news of the dramatic boardroom coup leaked to the press, a story too juicy for the Financial Times and the tabloids to ignore, the wedding video surfaced. It went viral globally within hours. The internet is a cruel, unforgiving place. Daniel became the international poster boy for greedy, narcissistic betrayal. Memes of his smug face at the altar juxtaposed with paparazzi photos of him carrying a cardboard box out of Ashford Global flooded every social media platform. His reputation was utterly annihilated. No reputable firm would touch him. His name was radioactive. He had burned every bridge, betrayed a billionaire, and caught a federal investigation for data leaking all in one weekend. His family fared no better. The Whitmores, once so desperate to be seen as upper class, became social pariahs. They were asked to resign from their country club due to the negative press. Their friends stopped returning their calls. Eleanor Whitmore, who had clapped at my humiliation, found herself completely isolated, unable to show her face at her weekly luncheons without enduring the scorching whispers of the women she used to desperately try to impress. Karma, it turned out, didn't just bite. It devoured, Exactly 1 month after the wedding that never was. A heavy thunderstorm rolled through Manhattan. Rain lashed furiously against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. I was sitting in my library, reviewing quarterly projections, when the intercom buzzed. It was the lobby concierge, Ms. Carter. I apologize for the interruption, but there is a Mr. Whitmore here. He is soaking wet and refusing to leave the lobby. He says he needs 5 minutes of your time. Should I call the police? I stared at the intercom for a long moment. Send him up, but have a guard escort him and wait by the elevator. A few minutes later, my front door opened. Daniel stood in the foyer. He looked completely unrecognizable. He had lost at least 15 pounds. His clothes were rumpled. His hair was a mess, and he was drenched from the rain. He looked at the staggering opulence of my penthouse, the sweeping staircases, the original artwork, the sheer scale of the wealth he had thrown away, and a fresh wave of agony washed over his face. He fell to his knees right there on the marble floor. Emily, he choked out, tears instantly mixing with the rainwater on his face. Emily, I am so sorry. I stood leaning against the archway of the library, holding a cup of tea. I felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. No love. Just a profound emptiness. You have 3 minutes. Daniel. Then the guard takes you away. I made the biggest mistake of my life. He sobbed, his hands clutching his wet jacket. Vanessa left me. The SEC froze my bank accounts. I can't get an interview anywhere. I lost everything. Everything. I was stupid. I was blind. Please. You have to know I loved you. I really loved you. He reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out a velvet box. He opened it, revealing the simple engagement ring he had given me. The one he had demanded I return through the lawyers. Please. He begged, staring up at me with pathetic, desperate eyes. Can we go back? Can we start over? I'll do anything. I'll sign a prenup. I'll scrub floors. Just please. Forgive me. I walked slowly toward him. I stopped just a few feet away, looking down at the man who had shattered my heart in front of 300 people. I calmly reached out and pushed the lid of the velvet box shut. You don't understand. Daniel, I said softly, my voice calm, contrasting the roaring thunder outside. You didn't lose me because you chose another woman. He looked up at me, confused, sniffling. You lost me because you thought my value depended on my bank account. I continued, kneeling down so I was eye level with him. You looked at me, the woman who cooked for you, who supported you, who loved you unconditionally, and you decided I was worthless because I didn't have a title. You didn't want a partner. You wanted an acquisition. I stood back up, smoothing out my slacks. I don't hate you, Daniel. Hate requires emotional energy. I refuse to waste on you. You're just irrelevant. I looked at the security guard waiting by the door. Take him out, and tell the front desk that if he ever approaches this building again, he will be arrested for trespassing. Daniel collapsed forward, sobbing uncontrollably onto the marble, begging and screaming my name as the massive security guard hauled him to his feet and dragged him backward into the elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off his cries and returning my penthouse to peaceful silence. I didn't let the betrayal break me. I let it forge me. Over the next year, I officially assumed the role of active CEO and chairwoman of Ashford Global. I completely overhauled the corporate structure. I fired the toxic, Nepotistic executives Caldwell had installed and promoted brilliant, hardworking employees who had been overlooked. I implemented a massive profit-sharing program for the lower-level workers. I built a culture of transparency, loyalty, and merit. I didn't seek further revenge against Daniel. I didn't have to. The universe, aided by the sheer force of his own hubris, had handled that for me. Sometimes, I look back on that day in the cathedral. It feels like a lifetime ago. A different girl living a different life. I had been terrified of the power I inherited. Terrified of what money does to people. But I learned that money doesn't change who you are. It acts as a magnifying glass, exposing your true character to the world. My wealth exposed me as someone who values loyalty and integrity over status. And it exposed Daniel as a man whose soul was so incredibly cheap, it could be bought with a fabricated job title. Daniel thought he was marrying into power. He never realized that the woman he abandoned was the one who had given him every opportunity in the first place. The wedding lasted 15 minutes. The consequences lasted forever.